Nasa v'nishma, then I want to go back to Baruch Sha'omar. But I'm having such a hard time with Nasa v'nishma. You would think that there's 100 sichos of the Rebbe Nasa v'nishma. There aren't. I mean, there are many. The Rebbe mentioned it many times, but a sicha in Likkutei Sichos I can't find, which is deeply surprising. I'm working on it. That's a euphemism for all kinds of stuff that are unmentionable. I'm working on it. Okay. The Rebbe used to say, I'll try my best is better than most people's, I promise. I'll try my best. I'll try my best. Okay. Rabbi Yossi, it's a new sicha. This is a Rashi sicha. It's a Rashi sicha. And in these classes, we're not focusing on Rashi. It's not our priority. We're focusing on Chassidus, right? That's what we're doing. We're using the Rebbe sichos as a lens, as a screen against the Chumash. We're learning the stories of the Chumash through the lens of the Rebbe sichos. That's our issue. And of course, the point is to cull out, to extract from these sichos a version of the story of the Torah which is consistent with Chassidus, that's enlightening and rich. And we've been doing this now for quite a while, and it's a labor of love. It's fun. It's work, but it's fun. I got up early this morning and I learned the sicha. That's what I did. But the sichas that we learn by and large, or to say it more precisely, the way we read the sichas is that we try to extract from the sicha not the technical scholarly aspect as much as the human or spiritual or mystical aspects. This is our intent. This sicha is a technical sicha, but we'll make it into, hopefully, something which is a little bit more meaningful. If you look at the text that I just gave you, on page 118, I ran through two horizontal lines through the text. Because this sicha has two halves. There's a first half and a second half. And it's really striking to what extent that this is a fact, that we're reading one sicha, that one half is in one world and the other half is in the other world. They're very, very different. They're not very, very different. They're different. It's two levels. The problem that I have with the sicha is that we're all animal lovers. And loving animals is a good thing. Loving everything the Eibishter created is a good thing. We've become so sensitive to nature as a culture, as a world, which is right. I'm not an extremist by any means. I think they need to have balance. I do believe with my whole heart that human beings come before animals. And I believe that anybody says otherwise is not normal, is sick. If you don't have a Torah, it's all whatever you want it to be. But if you do have a Torah, the Torah gives guidelines. And one of the guidelines of the Torah is that the whole world was created for human beings. But at the same time, part of the whole world being created for human beings, that human beings are the stewards of the world. There's a Rambam that speaks about animal conservation. You know that? There's a Ramban that speaks about the preservation of nature. In other words, if anybody thinks it's not Jewish to worry about species going extinct, the Rambam says it in the Nevuchim. The Rambam says the reason we only eat certain animals is because the animals that we eat tend to have many members in their kind. Because the animals, of which there are few, we shouldn't eat because we want to preserve them. Well, the Rambam writes. Very simple. And of course, the Ramban in Pashas Kiseitze, when he talks about Baltashchis, talks about the idea that it's our job to sustain everything in the world, ecosystems, nature. But the balance is not based on ecological criteria alone. Because we don't believe in the cycle of life being a circle. We believe in the cycle of being a straight line. The earth serves the plants and the earth serve the animals, and the earth and the plants and the animals serve man, and man serves God. And the direction of everything is upward. And therefore, It is man's job to have many babies. God said we should have a lot of children and didn't put an asterisk over there until you're worried about destroying the forests and the rivers. It's our job to live in this world in a way that there's room for everything and everybody. But that doesn't mean that we should have less children. It means you have to just be more efficient in how we use the nature of the world. And the world serves man. This is Torah. This is Torah. This is Torah. And Torah is not changing for anybody or anything ever. Torah believes that man serves God and that the world serves man, but that man is responsible. So there's a balance between man taking care of nature and not being equal to nature. A human being is more important than an animal, period. Even if there's 7 billion human beings and there's 6 animals of a particular type, human beings take precedence over animals. This is the Torah's position. And of course this is very insensitive and not kind and not globally conscious. But if you have an open mind and a critical mind and you think it through till the end, and don't get stuck by your heart and by your emotions and wanting to sound like you're a loving person, you'll agree with the Torah. You'll agree with the Torah. It just takes a little bit of deliberateness and critical thinking and not caring what anybody else feels and thinks, and you'll agree with the Torah. But there's no doubt that we're living in a time that we're very sensitive to animals. This morning I came to yeshiva, and when I walked into the room, the question the boys jumped on me with was, is fishing for sport tzar l'chaim? If you catch a fish and you throw it back, is that tzar l'chaim? I think it is. I think it absolutely is. But for some people, if you can't fish and throw back, you can't fish. In other words, some people don't fish for sport, they fish for food. But if you're fishing for food, there are rules. The fish has to be a certain size, otherwise you have to throw it back. So it becomes a shaila. If I'm catching fish to feed my family and I pull a fish out of the water and it's a not kosher fish, or it's too small, and I throw it back, is that tzar l'chaim? But if you're just catching fish for sport, I think it is tzar l'chaim. So here's an unusual incident in the Chumash, which is very disturbing, but I have to bring it up because I'm not a liar. At least I try not to be. One of the stories in the Chumash is a story of Avraham Avinu cutting a bunch of animals in half. Remember that? It's called the covenant between the parts. Avraham Avinu is instructed by the Creator of the world to take Egla Mishuleshes, Ayel Mishulash, and Eiz Mishulash, V'Toyer V'Goizel, and to cut them in half, to slice them in half.
Way.
First of all, what difference does it make? And second of all, the assumption is that he cut them lengthwise, meaning he literally split the animals in half. Now, was he allowed to kill them first, or did he have to cut them in half while they were still alive? There's no indication in the Torah. I'm assuming that Avraham Avinu killed them in a humane way. Perhaps he even shechted them, kosher. Avraham Avinu kept mitzvahs. But then he sliced them in half, and he placed them at 2 sides of a path, and he walked through between the halves, and a fire came out of the heaven and walked through between the halves, and this is called very, very famously Bris Bein HaBisharim, the covenant between the halves, the covenant between the parts. Rashi brings from the Targum that there's 2 words that sound very similar, but they're not the same. This Palgaya and this Paglaya. Palgaya means the halves, and Paglaya means the corpses. And in the Chumash, a bird, as this event is taking place, Vatera the Ayat Allah Pagodim, a raptor, a bird of prey, a scavenger descends on these dead animals, and Avraham has to send them off. And of course, you understand yourself that the Torah doesn't tell the story because it happened. The Torah tells the story because this is a very important part of the meaning of the story. Every story in the Torah has depth, and the story of Bris Ben Absadim is one of the most critical stories in our history. So the fact that bird shows up and Avraham has to send it off is critically important to the story. But okay, that's just a detail. But the whole idea of a covenant being made between man and God by killing animals is disturbing to us. It is. We kill and eat meat. I don't think most of us have a conscience about that. Maybe some of you do. But killing and eating meat is exactly that, killing and eating meat. You kill the animals as humanely as you can, although you wouldn't necessarily want to go to the slaughterhouse because maybe you would discover that it could be more humane. We kill and eat meat. But killing an animal or cutting an animal in half for the purposes of a service, of a covenant, it just rings wrong. It just doesn't feel right. But if I may be so direct, if it says in the Torah, it's not only emes, but it's correct. The Torah tells the story. Hashem tells Avraham Avinu, slice the animals in half, walk through between the parts, and this is going to be our covenant. That itself is proof that this is an appropriate thing. It's a correct thing. Now, how could it be seen as a correct thing? So first of all, I repeat again, it doesn't say any place in the Torah that Avraham had to cut the animals in half while they were still alive. He could have killed them first through shechita, and so they would not have suffered the pain of being sliced in half. But the very fact that Hashem says it is the proof that it's correct. Because the God's the boss. He's not only the boss because he made the world, God, he's the boss because he wrote the blueprint. He understands his creation, and he understands what his creation is for, and he understands what each aspect of the creation contributes to the greater purpose. And this is the right thing, for these animals to be sliced in half, to be used for the Bris Ben Apsadim. Like you have in the next parsha, that there's this ram that is running to Avraham Avinu to replace Yitzchak and the Akedah, remember? And its antlers get entangled in the trees, and Avraham goes after it, and he shechts it. That ram delighted in being a carbon, because there's nothing more important than Akedah's Yitzchak, and this animal had the merit of replacing Yitzchak on that Mizbeach. This is a similar thing. The event of Bris Bein Apsadim is very fateful, it's very important, because it establishes the covenant between Avraham Avinu and the Eibishter for two things, as we know. God made two promises to Avraham Avinu, and the covenant between the parts was primarily for the second one, but for purposes of being nice, we'll say for two reasons. Number one, Bris Hazera, and number two, Bris Ha'aretz, the covenant of seed and the covenant of the land. The covenant of the seed means God Almighty said to Avraham Avinu, in 4,000 years hence, your grandchildren are going to call themselves Bnei Avraham. In 4,000 years from today, your children are going to say, who am I? I'm a son of Abraham. And who is Abraham? A servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And guess what? It's worked out. It's almost 4,000 years since Bris Bein Apsadim, and we call ourselves Avraham Avinu's children. I want to tell you, I lived on Carroll in Kingston when I first got married. And I worked on Crown and Albany. I would walk by the building 520 Crown every day at 6 o'clock. And there was a man sitting on the steps. He was there all the time. I don't know how employed he was. And I would pass and he would mutter, there goes Abraham. Every day, there goes Abraham. I was very complimented. I imagine he said it to every Jew in Joseph to me, there goes Abraham. But he looked at a Yid, he saw Avraham Avinu. Because every Yid is Avraham Avinu. So the first promise was we would be his children forever, and we would be Hashem's. And the second promise was of the Holy Land, that Eretz Yisrael would be eternally the land of the Jewish people. So when the Eibishter promised Avraham Avinu Zerah, when Hashem promised Avraham Avinu the seed, the blessing of the seed, that his offspring would be his forever, Avraham Avinu believed him. And it says in the Chumash, V'hemin b'adeshem v'yachshaveh alei tzedakah. He believed him. Hashem says, I promise you, your children are going to be my children forever, and Avraham believed him. It's considered a great act of tzedakah on Avraham Avinu's part. But then he told him, I'm promising you this land, this strip of land along the coast of the Mediterranean is going to be identified with the Jewish people forever. And Avraham said, prove it. He didn't say prove it, he didn't believe it. He said, I need something to certify it, to strengthen it. Because Avraham Avinu understood that for human beings to carry his name for 4,000 years is easier than for a piece of land to carry his name for 4,000 years. And we see today what it means. Eretz Yisrael is the most contended strip of land in the world. It's always been this way. It's unbelievable. Eretz Yisrael has been fought over forever. Now what is it? It's a tiny little piece of desert, flanked by the Mediterranean Sea on the one side and the Jordan River on the other, and the whole world is fighting over it, and it's called by everybody the Holy Land. And it's called by everyone the Holy Land because it's the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So when Avraham Avinu was promised by HaKadosh Baruch Hu the Bris Ha'aretz, the covenant for the land, he said, Mamo Eida Ki Iroshena, for this I need to have certification. And the Eibishter said, Choli Egla Mashulash, Ve'ez Meshulash, Ve'ayel Meshulash, Ve'ez Meshulash, as Ve'ayel Meshulash, take a healthy calf and a healthy goat and a healthy ram and slice them in half, and then take a young pigeon and an older pigeon and keep them alive, don't cut them in half, and you walk through between the parts. So those three animals, if they were shechted kosher, maybe Avraham Avinu ate them later. I don't know. Maybe he didn't eat them later. But they have the schus They literally have this chus that through them the covenant between Hashem and the Jewish people was established. It was the first covenant. Avraham was 70 at that time. It's before Bris Milah. It's before the covenant of circumcision. This is an earlier covenant. The first covenant the Jewish people on the Eibush of Avraham Avinu is the Bris Bein Apsada. But it's still weird to imagine slicing an animal in half. It is. It's hard to, in our sensibility, if we lived 200 years ago, we wouldn't think like this. But in our sensibility, but it's Torah. Torah tells us the truth. Now, there's 2 points here. The first point is the word covenant, and the second point is the word parts. B'sarim. So let's talk about the word covenant first. Bris. Covenant. Now, we have been learning about covenants all winter because we're learning about the gators of the Jewish people. The topic that we're learning about is the 5th day of preparation for the giving of the Torah. We've been sitting on this, I don't know when we started this, Kislev time. Whenever we started, I got sick in the middle. You have to remember that part of the reason we haven't covered that much ground is I was missing for a month or more. I can't even remember it. I was so sick. They just made a big nest for me, Baruch Hashem. I was quite ill. I was very ill. But I forgot about it. I mamish forgot about it. When I went to the oil after the first time, I said, I'm asking that I shouldn't walk around in fear. That I should not be afraid of Chas v'Shalom getting sick again. I'm a young man. I got really sick, but so what? I should vergessen, Mamish, Sean Ferguson. I forgot about it. I forgot about it so much. Forgive me for saying this. Maybe not forgive me, because maybe you can beat up on me about it. I even stopped exercising, Rahman al-Islam, which is not a good thing, which is a terrible thing. But my middle name is Lazy. The last letter of Paltiel is for the L, is for lazy. I don't know what the P and the A and the L and T and the I E are, but the L is for lazy. Maybe the first L is for lazy. I got 2 L's in my name. Lazy, Paltiel. Okay. So we've been talking about covenant all winter. Hashem made a bris with the Jewish people. The bris is the terms that define our unique relationship, and Jewish people do have a unique relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with the Eibush God Almighty. He says to us 2 things: Shemayu tishbu v'keli. You'll listen to my voice and you'll do what I say. And he offers us 3 things: Segula, to be his treasure; Mamlechas Kohanim, a kingdom of priests; V'gei Kodesh, and a holy nation. This is a deal. It's an arrangement.
Would you restate the 3 things?
That we're going to be his treasure, we're going to be a kingdom of priests, and we're going to be a holy nation. He asks for 2 things: to learn Torah and do mitzvahs. And he offers us 3 things. We're going to be Segula, V'yisam li Segula, I'm going to be my precious treasure, and you're going to be Mamlechas Kohanim V'gei Kodesh. And remember, every one of these ideas we spent so much time studying in the Sichos. We've covered a lot of ground over the last 15 years. We is the collective. The classes are online. You can go get them.
I will. I'll try.
But it's a covenant. It's a covenant. What is the meaning of a covenant? Again, we've talked about this over and over and over again. A covenant means where 2 people create a bond, and they do not want the bond to be defined by logic. Because any bond defined by logic can be unbonded when the logic changes, when the circumstances change. People come together reasonably. People come together for all kinds of reasons. But people are brought together by certain extraneous phenomena. Okay, so I always use the same examples. You and your friend like each other.
Based on the fact that you like baseball.
You're the only 2 Democrats in Crown Heights, or the only 2 liberal Democrats, or 2 Republicans. You both like a certain ball team, or you both like a certain, I don't know what, music. Ich weiß was. People have all kinds of reasons that bring them together. You work in the same place. You have similar hobbies. There's a million reasons why people can be bonded. And that creates friendship. And friendship is a very important thing for people. We're not solitary. So the Chazal say that most friendships are called Ava Tluya B'Davar. They're conditional friendships. And because they're conditional friendships, they subside. They pass over time. I had a childhood friend that I was very, very close to. I really was very close to. And I regret letting that relationship slide. It's my fault. He wanted to. But you know what bonded us together? The New York Yankees. I'm talking, I was a 10-year-old, I was an 11-year-old. You have to understand, they won the pennant in 1976, they won the World Series 77, 78. I was the number one fan. And then I turned bar mitzvah and the Yankees died. Me and my interest in the Yankees and Thurman Munson and the Yankees championships died altogether. You don't know who Thurman Munson is, right? You weren't born yet. He was killed in a plane crash. He was the catcher. He was a really good player, a tough guy. And when he died, the Yankees died. And my interest, I turned bar mitzvah, and that's it. I burnt my baseball cards, which today would be worth thousands of dollars. Out of Pesach, when you burn the chametz, and that was the end of it. Now he took a couple more years to grow up. I went away to learn out of town, and we would come back, and we would talk. We talked about the Yankees, and at some point, I just wasn't interested in the Yankees. I wasn't interested in him. I recently sent him a message, and he laughed. It's 45 years later. Like, I got over it. I'm not suffering. But people have relationships for all kinds of reasons. And then the relationships end. So sometimes you make a covenant, you make a pact. The covenant and the pact says, maybe our bond was formed conditionally, but we're going to sustain that bond unconditionally. Perhaps what brought us together was something finite, but now we're going to add to that finite relationship a property, a quality of infinity. That's the meaning of a covenant. Or what they call in some cultures, a blood oath. People actually do it. You cut your finger and you touch blood, and now you share blood. It's symbolic, right? But that's what a covenant means. A binding of two people beyond the parameters of what bonded them. So that if you lose interest in music, or I lose interest in baseball, or you lose interest in Ich weiß was, we're still friends. We're still friends because we added to our friendship, we added to our relationship a supralogical aspect. That's the concept of a covenant. Now, when you study Chassidus analyzes the strength of a bond. Chassidus studies, where does the power to make a covenant come from? In other words, I can promise you the Brooklyn Bridge. I can promise you everything I don't own you can have. You know the joke, right? The communists came to town and they asked, if you had 1,000 cows and 1,000 acres of land and 4,000 sheep and 10,000 chickens, would you give it to the people? Of course. Everyone screams, yeah. If you had 500 cows and 1,000 goats and 4,000 chickens and 1,000 acres, would you give it to the people? Yeah. If you had, anyway, they got down to 1 cow and 3 goats and 5 chickens and 3 acres, would you give it to the people? Absolutely not. So the question becomes, if you're willing to give away 1,000 acres and 1,000 cows and 4,000 goats and 10,000 chickens, why won't you give away 3 acres and 1 cow and 3? Because that I have. That I own. And what I own, I'm not giving you. What I don't have, you can have it twice. You understand? People can promise anything. What makes a covenant work? And of course, the answer in the language of Chassidus is the madrega of the neshama called chaya. There's chaya and yechid mikol chaya. Chaya means will. People can will themselves into relationships. That's the philosophy. You're willing yourself into bonding yourself with another person on the level of ratzon. What brought you and me together was feeling. What brought me together was pleasure. You and me together was ideas. And we're saying we're going to use our will to make it stick. That's called a covenant, a bris. And then Chassidus said that when we're making a covenant with the Eibishter, there's another dimension, which is called Yechida, which is even deeper than that. And Yechida means that we're bonding ourselves with the Eibishter on a level which is beyond reason, but in a place where we're inherently one with him. In other words, not even really creating the bond, we're revealing the bond. And that can't happen between people unless they're blood relatives, brothers and sisters, parents and children. That's how Chassidus explains it. So the meaning of a bris is the binding of two people, which is beyond reason because of will. When you talk about the bris between Hashem and Yidden, you say that the binding is based on will, but not based on will that we're willing each other to be joined. We're finding a place where we're actually one and revealing that will. And that's why you have two levels in Bris. In many Maimonides Chassidus, they talk about a lower level of a covenant and a higher level of a covenant. The lower level of a covenant, which of course is possible not just for Jewish people, also for non-Jews, is based on Chaya and Ratzon. And the level of the covenant, which is called Yechida, is only possible for the Jewish people because only they have a Yechida. And it's represented most by Yitzchak's Bris Milah, by Yitzchak's circumcision. Not by Avraham circumcision, certainly not by Yishmael's circumcision, and also not by the Bris Bein Absarim, the covenant between the parts. Let's repeat. The covenant between the parts was made when Avraham Avinu was 70. The Bris Milah circumcision covenant was made when Avraham Avinu was 99. Yitzchak was born 1 year later, Avraham was 100, but his covenant of circumcision took place when he was not an adult, but when he was 8 days old. So the Rebbe has a sikha where the Rebbe explains when you make a covenant with the Eibishter, as an adult, your brain is involved. When you make a covenant with the Eibishter when you're 8 days old, you're not even making it. Only the Eibishter is making it. That makes the covenant transcendent. That makes the covenant the madrega of Yechida. So there are many examples of covenant. There are even many examples of covenant in our relationships with the Eibishter. And what is the meaning? A pact which goes beyond limits. So the first word is the word bris. The nature of the bonding is that we're not going to let it dissipate, even if the glue that brought us together in the first place is going to go away. So Eibishter gave us Torah, Eibishter gave us mitzvahs. Torah and mitzvahs are pretty cool. Most of the mitzvahs, most of the Torah, most of the time is pretty cool. But some parts of it irritate us because they're not in vogue today. Tomorrow they'll be in vogue again, but today they're not in vogue. And we're very disposed, we're very affected by our environment. And the covenant says, don't only do the mitzvahs you like, do the mitzvahs you don't like as well. But to give you this example, and I don't mean to push anybody into a corner, since the Torah allows us to eat meat, we kill and eat meat. Now we may come from a culture of vegetarianism or whatever it is, where people don't eat meat, and people don't eat meat for various reasons. And one of the reasons is because you don't feel like you want to, quote, take a life. There was a story that someone visited the Rebbe Rashab who was a vegetarian, and he talked about eating meat as being cruel. So the Rebbe Rashab said, when you bite into a cucumber is what? Because you don't hear him scream, it's allowed? That's what he said. Because you don't hear him scream, it's allowed. Every living thing feels. Some animals, we see that they feel. Other animals are not even sensitive to their feelings because they show emotion, they show pain in a very, very different way. Or some don't show it at all. It doesn't mean they're not experiencing it. So if a person can't eat meat because it's giving the animal pain, but by the same token, it can't bite into a cucumber because it's currently cucumber, so what's it supposed to eat? Salt and water? You can't live on that. You have to eat. The only way to stay alive is eat living things. Grass is living, vegetables are living, legumes are living. You cut them down. You eat them humanely. Yeah, you cut them down. You cook them in a pot. You grind them up, make it into a flour, knead them into a bread. But everything we eat is life coming from life. And life coming from life means intermittently there's death. Now, some people say eating vegetables and grains and rice and corn is okay because, quote, you have no choice. But animals, you don't need to eat, you shouldn't eat. But the real truth is, because the animal's pain they see, the wheat's pain they don't see, it's a very subjective thing. And the only one who knows what's right and wrong objectively is one who's not one of us. He doesn't have our biases, and his name is God. When he gave the creator of the world, he actually said in the beginning, you're not allowed to eat meat, you know that? Until the flood, human beings, killing an animal was equivalent to killing a human being. But after the Mabul, Eibishter said, now you're allowed. And if it's allowed, you should. You shouldn't deprive yourself of meat, you should. Again, if you're a vegetarian, don't take it the wrong way. I don't mean to stop your vegetarianism, but I'll be tight. If you're allowed to eat meat, you should eat meat, for reasons that I'm not going to get into at the moment. But you kill the animal in a humane way. You don't make the animal suffer. Here is a covenant. Bein absarim. You take an animal, you slice it in half, and you walk between the pieces. It doesn't feel right. It really doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. But Eibishter said, he knows best. Not only knows best because, quote, he could do whatever he wants, he knows best because he understands his world. And again, if I may speak for God out of turn, which is so silly, those animals consider themselves the most fortunate animals in the world that they were killed and used in this pact between Ram Avinu and the Eibishter. because they become by association a part of that covenant, which is a great shechita, a great lifting up of those animals. But okay, I've spoken enough about how uncomfortable it is, right? But why? Why do you cut an animal in half and walk through within the parts? And the answer is, when you cut an animal in half, it's still one animal. It's sliced in half. Now, of course, when you cut the animal in half, biologically, the animal's no longer alive. But philosophically, there's life there. And on the level of philosophy, where there is life, then life is a singularity. To explain what I'm saying in other words, and this is another whole kettle of fish, another whole can of garbanzo beans. I have a friend. He's not a close friend, he's an acquaintance. He's a very, very important person in Lubavitch. Very, very important man. He's a little younger than I am. He's a year or two younger than I am. He is responsible, he's the financial manager of an organization which is now called Teiras Menachem, that publishes all of the Rebbe's unedited sichos. And they started from 1950, they're holding now at 1977, 78. They're doing amazing work. They've been working on reissuing the Rebbe's old sichos in Hebrew since Gimel Tammuz, and they're doing wonderful work, incredible work. This young man it's not just a job, it's a labor of love. He's very into the Rebbe's Torah, very into the Rebbe's sichos. And he's very sharp, has a good head, a good memory. Whenever I meet him, he has something to say, and I have 1,000 questions that I want to ask him, but he remembers what he wants to tell me. I don't remember any of the questions that I have for him. But I see him one day in the street, and he's all excited. He says, we just found an answer we've been looking for decades. And what he meant to say was not that we knew the answer exists, but we couldn't find it, is we hoped the answer exists, but couldn't find it. It was about the question of cremation, which today is very, very popular. That somebody was asked about cremating a person who passes away, and there's so many reasons to do cremation. First of all, it's cheaper. Much cheaper. And second of all, it doesn't cost land. Land is the most precious thing in the world today. With 7 or 8 billion people, land is premium. And the person who's given, you bury a person in the ground and you give him Dalar Amas, halachically that piece of land belongs to him forever. You can't uproot him. You're not allowed to move him. You're certainly not allowed to excavate his bones and do scientific studies. It's considered bizi ames. You're not allowed to do it. Although scientists do it all the time. So the Rebbe was asked about cremation. Why is cremation not allowed? And the Rebbe said something very interesting. It's Chassidus. It's not biology, it's Chassidus, but it's very provoking. The Rebbe said that when the soul leaves the body falls apart. So if it takes time for the body to fall apart, it means it takes time for the soul to leave. If you burn the body, you're causing the body physical pain. Because there's life in that body. It's not biological life. It's not life the way scientists define what biology is, that it's renewing itself and it's sustaining itself, it's protecting itself from its environment and it's having babies. It's not alive on that level. But there's a neshama in that guf, there's a soul in that body, where the body would come back, would return back to dust. So that's why 2 things are true in halacha. Number 1, you don't burn people, you bury them. And number 2, you bury them as soon as possible because you want them to deteriorate. You want the body to come apart. Because as the body goes to pieces, the soul is able to leave. Tzaddikim is a different story, but for most of us, you want the neshama to leave the guf, to go to Gan Eden and get judged, to go to the heavenly court and get judged, and to end up safe, ultimately in Gan Eden. But for that to happen, the body has to release the soul. For the body to release the soul, the body has to come apart. But if you accelerate the process, the body feels physical pain. That's the Rebbe's argument. Now, if we accept that argument as true, and we are accepting that argument as true because this building belongs to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he's the king here. He's also the Rebbe. He's also a good guy. He's also a lot of good stuff. Yeah. So the Rebbe says that when a person dies, if the body is intact, they're still living, it's just that you don't see life. The same is true of an animal. A living animal is killed and sliced in half. I'm going with that, okay? I'm going to go with the argument that Avraham Avinu, before he cut the cow in half, slit its throat and let it bleed out because he wasn't trying to be extra cruel. There's no indication that he was not allowed to shecht at first. I could be wrong. But if that animal had any shape of an animal, there was life there. So you slice the animal in half, you put it on 2 sides of a road, you have one living thing that's cut in half. One living thing is cut in half. And as long as that body does not deteriorate, there's life here. Hypothetically, theoretically, and I know this is very hypothetical, you put it back together and it comes back to life. You know that there are small, very, very small organisms, primitive organisms, that if you rip them apart, they'll naturally, by nature, put themselves back together again. In other words, there's an awareness that's beyond the biology, which is like a proof for the soul almost. You ripped the biological components to pieces, it's dead. And yet somehow these dead pieces have enough awareness to reconstruct themselves in an orderly way, which means they never died. Cows don't do that. Human beings, lyhadus, don't do that. But in philosophy, that's the case. This is the meaning of the bris ben absarim. This is the meaning of slicing an animal in half and walking through between the parts, because philosophically that animal is living and it's one. So when two entities, in this case Avraham Avinu and the Eibishter, walk through between the parts that have been sliced in half, they're being bonded by one living thing. The two halves of the animal are considered one living thing, and on some philosophical level, it's still living. And on the level where it's still living, it's one. And they're bonding Hashem and Avraham Avinu in one living thing. That is the philosophical significance of bris ben absarim, walking through between the parts. That's the hezbollah. That's the pshat. And that's the second key idea. Right? The first key idea is the word bris, covenant. And the second idea is psarim, that you take one living thing, you divide it in half, in a way that on some philosophical level is still considered one and is still considered living. When you walk through between those two parts, that single living thing, you become a part of it. And when you become a part of it, and the Eibush are the part of it, you and the Eibush are part of the same living entity. That's the concept of the bris ben absarim. You follow? And the very first covenant ever made between Yid and the Eibush was made when Avraham Avinu was 70. It precedes the bris milah by 30 years. And it was, as I explained to you, it was bris hazera and bris haaretz. It was the covenant for the seed and the covenant for the land, especially for the land. And it was achieved by taking one living thing, dividing it in half and walking through between the parts. That one living thing is still considered one. And when you walk between its parts, you're part of its oneness. And if you're part of the cow, and the Eibush is part of the cow, you're both part of the same cow. That's kind of weird to say, but that's the way it goes. You understand, right? We're going to learn a sikha. The whole sikha is about splitting something in half. And the Rebbe is going to argue that this splitting something in half is connected to this concept of bris ben absarim. Just like when Hashem made a covenant with Avraham Avinu, when Avraham Avinu was 70 years old, he was told by God Almighty, "Koli egg mishul, egla mishul, ve'ez mishul, ve'ayil mishul, ve'teira gezel." Take the best calf of the herd, the best goat of the herd, the best ram of the herd, and slice them in half. And you and I, Avraham Avinu, and a fire which is representative of the Eibishter, however you explain what that fire is, kavod nivra or lakus, whatever, went through between the parts. Those parts are one living thing, and they make the Eibishter and Avraham Avinu into one singular living thing as a unit. That's the type bris ben absarim. But what's being sliced in half in Parshas Mishpatim is not an animal. It's an animal's blood. Hashem makes a covenant with the Jewish people on Friday, the day before the Torah was given. Correct? Now, we've been learning this for how many months? We learned several sichas, 2 or 3 sichas that all spoke about this covenant. Now, the word that we chose correctly is not the word covenant. We use the word conversion. Every Jew was converted to Judaism, but he was converted to Judaism through a covenant. And some of the sichas we learned pointed out how this covenant was less than the covenants about Torah, because the Torah had not been given. Other of the sichas will point that this covenant is greater than, more advantageous than the covenants, than the conversions which would happen after the Jewish people were born. Okay? But these are all details. The point is we're learning about the covenant. This sicha talks about the most ritualistic aspect of it. Taking blood and dividing it in half. Dividing the blood in half, argues that Rebbe brings from many Sfarim, is the equivalent of Hashem telling Avraham Avinu, Pashas Lech Lecha, take the animals and slice them in half. That's the sikh. What's gorgeous about the Sikha is that there's two versions of understanding what you're slicing in half. The first half of the Sikha explains it more basically, simpler, more generally. And the second half of the Sikha goes much deeper, and it's really a journey which is worthwhile. Okay, now I think that I just covered a lot of ground, and I also think that I was quite clear. I need to have your input and your questions, and then we're going to break.
I have a question.
Talk
about
loud.
Something you said about people that, for example, dying on Kiddush Hashem, but they can't get to a burial. So what exactly happened to their neshama?
First of all, the neshama don't worry about. It's the guf you have to worry about. And the reason you have to worry about the guf is because of Tchias HaMeis. It's painful for the guf when they're cremated. I mean, in the Gemara there's a story. And that story in the Gemara was repeated during the Holocaust also many times, where the Gemara says they were taking captives from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. I think to Bavel, but I could be wrong. And they took young girls. And the girls understood why they were being taken. Young women. They were not being taken to knit sweaters. So they asked their husbands, they asked the men, if someone drowns in the sea, do they have a chelik and el mabo? If they drown in the sea, then they don't get buried. They get eaten by the fish, they sink to the bottom of the canyons at the bottom of the ocean. And a person's supposed to be buried. If a person gets buried, they have a place, right? And the Tchias HaMeisim, the way I always tell you, the Gemara sort of describes it this way. Tchias HaMeisim is, when a person dies, you bury them in the ground, the body decomposes, one little bone called Etzem Luz never decomposes, and that's a seed. And when the time comes, that seed germinates, it multiplies, and it grows out of the ground like grass. Tchias HaMeisim is described as a human being growing out of the ground like grass, but if you don't get buried. So they asked their husbands, their rabbis, if someone dies at sea and doesn't have kvura, they have a Tchias HaMeisim, so they quoted a pasuk, which says that even if you go by Mitzulas Yam, in the depth of the sea, you have Tchias HaMeisim, and all of them jumped off the boat into the water. They took their own lives, so they shouldn't be used for Aveda. So there's precedent for this question. And the answer is, the tzad is real. That when you don't let the body decompose naturally, it's painful. But that's done. What's done is done. But Tchias HaMeisim you have. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell you a painful story, very, very painful story. In Europe, there was a school which was called Beis Yaakov. You all have heard of Beis Yaakov, right? Beis Yaakov is all over the world. It's the most preeminent name of girls' schools, Beis Yaakov.
My best friend went.
Huh?
My best friend went.
Went to Beis Yaakov. Who founded Beis Yaakov? A woman. In an age where women did not have leadership positions. Her name was Sarah Shneider. She was a tzaddikus pashut. And she founded it, I think, right after the First World War, maybe even earlier. And she built a very successful network. Her students were pashut scholars. I mean, by today's standards, they were scholars. They didn't learn Gemara, but they knew Tanakh with Mefarshim backwards and forwards. They were really learned women. The Rebbitzins, when my mother went to Beis Yaakov 60 years ago, her Rebbitzins were graduates of the Beis Yaakov of Rebbitzin Sarah Shneider. I mean, the schus that this one woman has. She went to the Belzer Rebbe, to the Pesach HaDoiv, who passed away in 1926. It gives you an idea of timing. With her brother. She wouldn't go in alone. And she presented it to the Belzer Rebbe, and the Belzer Rebbe said what the Rebbe would always say, B'racha v'atzlach. He didn't speak much. B'racha v'atzlach. These holy Jews, they're very cheap on words. But the words are very powerful, few and powerful. Blessing and success. I read a book on Sarah Shneider. The last page of the book is a letter. She had a bunch of students who were arrested by the Nazis. They were taken away. And she had already passed. She passed away much earlier. And they understood that they were not being taken for work. They were not being taken to work at the factory. They were taken for something else. So they wrote a letter, and this letter was smuggled out. And some people say the letter's not true, but I read the letter. It's very powerful. Where they write about their predicament. It's written very edel, but they describe what's going to happen. And they indicate in that letter that they're going to collectively take their lives. rather than be subject to Aveda. And the letter finishes tomorrow. Tomorrow will all be with Sarah Imedu. That's how they finish the letter. With Sarah Imedu, they meant Sarah Schneider. That's the letter. Anyway, so to answer your question, a person whose body is burnt, there's tzar, there's pain when the body is being burnt. The body has to be allowed to go apart by itself. But the Tchias HaMesim, it has no bearing. Okay, I'm answering you. Okay? Anybody has comments or questions? So let's break, okay? I'm going to go downstairs and get myself some poison, and we'll start the Sikha. I gave you a very good introduction. Really, I did.